In today's video, I'm going to show you why Jesus said the Father was greater than him in John 14 verse 28. And by the end of today's video, I'm going to give you two verses you can use if you ever discuss this with somebody who doesn't believe that Jesus is God. Let's just read the passage first and foremost. And most people just focus on this last part of the verse where it talks about Jesus saying, I'm going unto my Father because my Father is greater than I. We'll come back to the rest of this verse by the end of today's video, so make sure you stick around to the end. What Jesus was saying there in John chapter 14 is a flowing conversation which goes through John 13 all the way through to John chapter 17. So if somebody, or if you are reading this by yourself and you pick out this one verse out of this wider context, hopefully now you can start to see why some people mistake what this passage actually means. This is what's commonly referenced as the Last Supper sermon from John's Gospel account. And the first 5 verses in the context of this particular passage give us a mind-boggling amount of insights to what Jesus was speaking about in John chapter 14, verse 28. Notice how the passage begins. It talks about how before the feast of the Passover, right, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, and notice this, right? This is vital here, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father. Having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. So to start this sequence during the Passover, the gospel writer John is telling us here that Jesus knew his hour was come. He was now leaving the earth, right, to go back to the Father. When supper had ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's, to betray him, notice this, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and notice this key part here as well, and that he was come from God, and he went to God. So John is outlining here that Jesus knew his hour was coming, right, to depart out of the world, to go back to the Father. In verse 3 here is clearly highlighting that Jesus knew that he was come from God and that he was going to God. He went to God, right? He rised from supper and he laid aside his garments and took a towel and girded himself. And verse 5, as we're going to see in a moment, is going to give us a pivotal piece of insight to what Jesus was speaking about in John 14 verse 28, but also at the same time, what John has already prepared for us from the beginning of his gospel account. As we scroll down to read verse 5, notice what it says. After he had poured water into a basin, he began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe with the towel where he was basically girded with. So if you haven't caught this already, in chapter 13, verse 1 to 5, Jesus is giving us a visual illustration of what John the gospel writer has already told us Jesus did in the first chapter of his gospel account. Because in the start of John's gospel account, he outlines how the eternal word who was with God, but was also God, came to earth and took on flesh to save mankind. In likewise manner, in chapter 13, what are we seeing? God, disrobed, right, took on flesh, so to speak, got water and was washing his disciples' feet. He was cleansing them. It was a visual illustration of God entering the world and saving his creation. And this is made even more clear if you didn't see this already. When you scroll down, we could look at verses 12 and we could look at verses 15 as well. And notice what it says. It says, after he had washed their feet and taken his garments and was sat down again, right? Notice what verse 1 to 5 said. Jesus knew his hour was come, that he had come from God, and now he was going back to God. What did he do? After he's washed the disciples' feet, right? He's now putting on the robe again. And notice what it said. And he said, know you what I have done to you? So he's asking them a question. Do you know why I just did what I did? I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. So just as Christ took up his cross, what is the same mandate we as Christians have? We are to take up our cross and to die daily. Now remember I said we're going to go back to John 14 verse 28 to read the whole of the verse. But bear in mind, remember I said at the start of this video, this encounter goes through chapter 13 all the way to chapter 17. So even after we talk about this verse here, I want us to speak about something in chapter 17 which ties this whole knot in regards to John's gospel account. So going back to John 14 verse 28 here, notice what he says. Off the backdrop of what we've just discussed, starting from chapter 13, he says, "Ye have heard how I said unto you, I go away and come unto you. If ye loved me, ye would rejoice." Why would you rejoice at the fact that Jesus, who's come into earth, disrobed himself, would be going back to the Father? He says, "Because I said, I go unto the Father, for my Father is greater than I." You see, with the backdrop of chapter 13 and the ultimate backdrop of chapter 1 verse 1 down to this particular point in time, Jesus is highlighting quite clearly, look, I was with the Father before I came here. I lowered myself. I took on flesh and put myself in a lower position right now to save mankind. And you should be happy that I'm going back to the Father. Why? Because my Father is greater than I, because he's in a better position than I am in right now, and I want to go back there. This is why when you get to the end of this sort of narrative, notice what Jesus is saying here in John chapter 17 verse 5. He says, "And now, O Father, glorify thou me." So Jesus is asking for the Father to glorify him. With what though? With thine own self. So he wants glory that the Father has. And he says, "With the glory that I had with you," when? Before the world was. So just as John opens up his gospel account, and just as Jesus towards the end of the Last Supper sermon is saying here, he wants to go back because he knew his hour was come now to go back to the Father. Now, I mentioned at the start of today's video, I want to give you two verses you can use which will probably help you if you ever discuss this sort of passage with somebody who doesn't believe Jesus is God. First, I want to take you to this passage right here, 2 chapters before chapter 17 in John 15 verse 24, because notice what Jesus says here, and this will be very relevant to the next verse I'm about to show you in a moment, because it says, "If I had not done among them the works which none other man did, they had not had sin, but now have they both seen and hated both me and my Father." So the reason I'm highlighting this particular passage is because Jesus is highlighting that he's done works that nobody has ever done before him. And this is vital because when people go to John 14:28 and say Jesus is claiming that the Father was greater than him, the next verse I want you to go to is this verse right here in verse 12, because notice what Jesus says here. He says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that believes on me, the works that I do, shall he do also." But notice what Jesus says next. He says, "And greater than these shall he do." Why? "Because I go unto my Father." The reason you take them to this particular passage is because this is the same Greek word in verse 12 here that is used in verse 28. So for somebody who wants to hold that Jesus is saying that the Father is greater than him, and they believe this is talking about greater in essence or greater in power, and not necessarily speaking about just greater in position as he's here on earth, they would have to hold to the view that Jesus is saying here that the disciples would do greater, right, more powerful, better in quality, better in nature miracles. And I'm certain that not many Christians would be willing to say that the disciples did greater miracles than Jesus. The point is, the word greater can be used in different ways. And clearly with the disciples, it wasn't that they were doing greater quality miracles than Jesus, or greater in power, or greater in essence. They may have done greater volume of miracles because they spent more time on earth doing miracles than Jesus obviously did in his short ministry. As always remember the context when it comes to finding out the answer to these sorts of biblical questions, and you'll be surprised at how many people really deny the deity of Christ. And I'll speak about that in this video here, when we discuss report findings which show that a large majority of people don't believe Jesus is God.